February 17, 1945. The skies above Germany. Captain Chuck Yeager pushed the throttle of his P-51 Mustang forward, feeling the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roar beneath him. He was part of a massive Allied fighter sweep, hundreds of Mustangs hunting what remained of the Luftwaffe. Below him, German Me-109s scattered like startled birds. Yeager rolled his fighter and dove, the four wing-mounted 50-caliber machine guns chattering to life. The sound was distinctive, a brutal hammering that every German pilot had learned to fear. What they didn't know was that Yeager's Mustang, like thousands of others, was equipped with a weapon system so devastating it had fundamentally changed air combat. The Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 2,800 rounds per minute, combined firepower. One burst and a Messerschmitt exploded in mid-air. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Yeager pulled up hard, G-forces pressing him into his seat, and acquired another target, another burst, another kill. By the time he landed that evening, the tally was in. American P-51 Mustangs had claimed over 100 German aircraft destroyed in a single day. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was being systematically obliterated by a combination of superior tactics, overwhelming numbers, and devastating firepower. This is the story of how one aircraft, armed with 4 50-caliber machine guns, became the weapon that shredded 5,000 Luftwaffe planes and broke the back of German air power forever. Hey, before we dive deeper into this incredible story of American air superiority and the fearless pilots who made it happen, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. Are you in New York? Los Angeles? Maybe somewhere in the heartland like Kansas City or Dallas? Or are you watching from overseas, curious about American military history? I love seeing where our viewers are from, and it helps me understand what kind of content resonates with you. Also, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're bringing you the most detailed, most thoroughly researched stories about World War II aviation that you won't find anywhere else. We're talking primary sources, pilot interviews, combat reports, the real stories that textbooks skip over. Your support keeps these videos coming, so take 2 seconds right now and smash that subscribe button. Now let's get back to the story of the P-51 Mustang and the gun that changed everything. The Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun wasn't invented for aircraft. It was designed in 1918 by John Moses Browning as a heavy machine gun for ground troops, something that could punch through light armor and fortifications. But by the late 1930s, American aircraft designers realized they had a problem. European fighters were getting faster, more heavily armored and better armed. The old 30-caliber machine guns that American planes carried were becoming obsolete. They just didn't have the punch to bring down modern aircraft quickly. Enter the M2 50-caliber. When you mounted 4 of these guns in the wings of a fighter, synchronized to converge at a point about 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, you created a cone of destruction that was absolutely lethal. Each gun fired a half-inch diameter bullet weighing around 2 ounces, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy alone was devastating, but the real innovation was in the ammunition. American ordnance engineers developed armor-piercing incendiary rounds specifically for air combat. These rounds had a hardened steel core that could punch through aircraft aluminum like tissue paper, followed by an incendiary compound that ignited on impact. When you hit a German fighter with a burst from 450 cals, you weren't just making holes. You were starting fires, severing control cables, exploding fuel tanks, and turning the aircraft into a flying coffin. The P-51 Mustang was the perfect platform for these guns. Designed originally for the British Royal Air Force in 1940, the Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and had incredible range thanks to its laminar flow wing design and internal fuel capacity. But the early versions were underpowered. That changed when someone had the brilliant idea of replacing the American Allison engine with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin. Suddenly, you had an aircraft that could fly at 440 miles per hour, operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and most importantly, escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The combination of range, speed, and firepower made the P-51 the most effective fighter aircraft of World War II, but it was the guns that made it lethal. 4 AN-M2 50-caliber machine guns, 2 in each wing with around 400 rounds per gun. That gave a Mustang pilot about 34 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. But pilots didn't do that. They learned to fire in short bursts, 2 or 3 seconds max, conserving ammunition for multiple engagements. A good pilot could make those rounds last for 6 or 7 separate attacks, and the effect on target was devastating. Let's talk about what actually happens when 4 50 caliber rounds hit an aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour. First, there's the immediate structural damage. Aircraft in World War II were made of aluminum alloy, strong enough to handle aerodynamic stress, but not designed to stop bullets. A 50 caliber armor-piercing round would punch through the skin, through internal structure, through anything in its path. If you hit the engine, you had a good chance of destroying it immediately. The rounds would penetrate the engine block, sever fuel lines, ignite oil, and cause catastrophic mechanical failure. If you hit the cockpit, the pilot was done. There was some armor plating behind the pilot's seat in most German fighters, but it wasn't enough to stop a 50 caliber round at close range. If you hit the fuel tanks, which in many German fighters were located in the fuselage just behind the cockpit, the incendiary compound would ignite the fuel and the aircraft would explode. German pilots called P-51s furniture vans because of their boxy appearance, but they feared them more than any other Allied fighter because of those guns. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf FW-190, hit by a sustained burst from a Mustang's 50s, had about a 3-second life expectancy. The aircraft would either explode immediately, catch fire and burn, or suffer such catastrophic structural damage that it would break apart in mid-air. Very few German pilots survived being hit by sustained 50 caliber fire. Even if the aircraft didn't explode, the pilot often couldn't bail out in time. Now let's talk about the tactics. Early in the war, American fighter pilots were taught to dogfight, to engage in turning battles with enemy aircraft using superior maneuverability to get on the enemy's tail. But the P-51 wasn't designed as a dogfighter. It was designed as an escort fighter and air superiority platform. The tactics evolved to match the aircraft's strengths. American pilots learned to use altitude and speed. They would patrol at high altitude, around 25 to 30,000 feet, watching for German fighters below. When they spotted a target, they would dive, building up speed to over 500 miles per hour in the dive. Make one high-speed pass with all 4 guns blazing, and then zoom back up to altitude. This boom and zoom tactic was devastatingly effective. The German pilot often never saw the Mustang coming. By the time he heard the guns firing, his aircraft was already on fire. If the Mustang pilot missed on the first pass, he had enough speed to climb back to altitude and set up another attack. The German pilot, meanwhile, was at a disadvantage. His aircraft was slower, he was already at lower altitude, and he knew that if he tried to dogfight with the Mustang, he'd eventually make a mistake and end up in those guns. Many German pilots simply tried to run when they saw Mustangs. But running didn't help. The P-51 was faster than almost every German fighter in level flight and could catch them easily. The kill ratio tells the story. By the end of 1944, P-51 Mustangs had achieved a kill ratio of roughly 19-1. For every Mustang lost in air combat, 19 German aircraft were destroyed. That's an absolutely staggering number. Compare that to earlier in the war, when American fighters were achieving maybe 3 or 4-1 at best. What changed? Better tactics, better training, and those 450 caliber guns. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immense. By early 1945, German fighter pilots were demoralized, undertrained, and flying aircraft that were often poorly maintained due to fuel and parts shortages. When they encountered P-51s, many simply didn't engage. They would jettison their external fuel tanks and dive for the deck, hoping to escape. But the Mustangs would follow them down and destroy them at low altitude. German training was so degraded by this point that new pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 30 hours of flight time. American pilots, by contrast, had hundreds of hours of training and were flying aircraft that were mechanically superior and better armed. The result was a slaughter. Let's talk about some specific engagements. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The Germans committed nearly 900 aircraft to the operation, hoping to destroy Allied air power on the ground and gain temporary air superiority. The attack achieved some surprise and destroyed around 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, but the German losses were catastrophic. Allied fighters, including P-51 Mustangs, shot down around 300 German aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots and squadron leaders it couldn't replace. It was one of the last major German air operations of the war, and it failed because when those Mustangs got airborne and engaged the German formations, the result was predictable. 450 caliber guns against aircraft, flown by inexperienced pilots in outdated tactics. The Germans were shot out of the sky. One Mustang pilot, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, shot down 2 FW-190s in the first few minutes of the engagement. He described the experience later as like shooting fish in a barrel. The Germans came in low and slow, trying to strafe parked aircraft, and the Mustangs bounced them from above. The 50s tore the German fighters apart before their pilots even knew what hit them. Another famous engagement was Big Week in February 1944, when Allied heavy bombers launched a sustained campaign against German aircraft factories. The goal was to destroy German production capacity and force the Luftwaffe to come up and fight, where Allied fighters could destroy them. It worked exactly as planned. The Germans had no choice but to defend their factories, and when they came up, the P-51 Mustangs were waiting. In 6 days of intense combat, Allied fighters shot down over 500 German aircraft. The Mustangs accounted for the majority of kills. The combination of long range, high speed, and devastating firepower meant that Mustangs could escort the bombers all the way to the target, fight off German interceptors, and still have enough fuel and ammunition to strafe targets of opportunity on the way home. German pilots called this period the week we lost the war in the air. They weren't wrong. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Production was disrupted, experienced pilots were dead, and the psychological advantage had shifted completely to the Allies. Individual pilots racked up impressive tallies. George Preddy was the top P-51 ace, with over 26 kills before he was killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day 1944. John Gentili had over 21 kills. John C. Meyer ended the war with 24 confirmed kills. These men were skilled, aggressive, and flew aircraft that gave them every advantage. But they all said the same thing in post-war interviews. The guns made the difference. One pilot described firing a burst into a Bf-109 and watching the entire tail section disintegrate. Another described hitting an FW-190's engine and seeing the whole aircraft engulfed in flame within 2 seconds. The 50 caliber rounds were simply too destructive for World War II aircraft to survive. Even if a German pilot managed to survive being hit and bailed out, his aircraft was finished. There was no bringing it back to base for repairs. A Mustang's guns didn't damage aircraft. They destroyed them completely. The Germans tried to counter the P-51 threat in various ways. They developed heavier armor for their fighters, but that made them slower and less maneuverable. They tried using cannon-armed fighters with 20mm and 30mm guns that could destroy a Mustang with just a few hits, but those guns had much lower rates of fire and limited ammunition. A German pilot might have 60 rounds for his cannon, enough for maybe 3 attacks. An American pilot had 1,600 rounds of 50 caliber, enough for many more engagements. The Germans also tried jet fighters like the Me-262, which was faster than the Mustang and could disengage at will. But jets were few in number, mechanically unreliable, and required long runways that were often bombed by the Allies. The Me-262 never existed in sufficient numbers to make a strategic difference. By the time it entered service in late 1944, the Luftwaffe was already a spent force. The impact extended beyond just air-to-air combat. P-51 Mustangs with their 450s were also incredibly effective ground attack aircraft. Once Allied fighters had cleared the skies of German aircraft, they would drop down to low altitude and strafe anything that moved. Trains, trucks, tanks, troop columns, airfields, anything. The 50 caliber rounds could punch through the thin armor of trucks and half-tracks easily. They could damage tank engines and tracks. They could set fuel trucks on fire. They could kill personnel in the open. German ground forces learned to dread the appearance of Mustangs because it meant death was coming at 300 miles per hour with 4 machine guns blazing. Some German units stopped moving during daylight hours entirely, waiting for darkness to avoid Allied air attack. That paralyzed German logistics and made it nearly impossible to move reinforcements or supplies during critical battles. The strategic impact was enormous. Germany's ability to wage war was being destroyed not just by bombers hitting factories, but by fighters hitting everything that moved. The total number of German aircraft destroyed by P-51 Mustangs is estimated at around 5,000. That's a staggering number. 5,000 aircraft, each one representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in manufacturing cost, thousands of man-hours of labor, and most importantly, a trained pilot who was either killed, captured, or so badly wounded he couldn't fly again. The Luftwaffe started the war with around 4,000 frontline aircraft. By 1945, it had been ground down to almost nothing, and P-51 Mustangs with their 450 caliber machine guns were the primary cause. The combination of American industrial capacity producing thousands of Mustangs, the training pipeline producing skilled pilots, and the tactical advantages of the aircraft and its weapons created an insurmountable advantage. Germany simply couldn't compete. They couldn't produce aircraft fast enough, couldn't train pilots adequately, and couldn't develop tactics to counter the Mustang's strengths. The result was inevitable. So when you look at the bigger picture, the P-51 Mustang armed with 4 AN/M2 50 caliber machine guns represents something larger than just a successful weapon system. It represents the American approach to war: overwhelming firepower, technological innovation, superior logistics, and aggressive tactics. The Germans had skilled pilots and decent aircraft, but they couldn't match American production or the sheer destructive capability of American weapons. The 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon designed in World War I, became the decisive air-to-air weapon of World War II when mounted on the right aircraft and used by well-trained pilots. It's a perfect example of how wars are won not by single innovations, but by the combination of good design, effective tactics, adequate training, and the industrial capacity to produce weapons in the quantities needed. The Luftwaffe was destroyed not in a single battle, but through thousands of individual engagements where American pilots with better aircraft and better guns systematically shot German pilots out of the sky until there was nothing left. That brings us to the end of this story about American air power, the P-51 Mustang, and the devastating effectiveness of the 50 caliber machine gun. These weren't just weapons, they were the tools that fearless American pilots used to achieve air superiority over Europe and pave the way for Allied victory. Every bomber crew that made it home safely owed their lives to Mustang pilots flying Escort. Every ground soldier who advanced without being strafed by German aircraft benefited from the Mustangs clearing the skies. The impact was total and decisive. If you found this story interesting, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves military history or aviation. Check out our other videos on World War II aircraft tactics and the incredible stories of the men who flew these missions. We've got content on the B-17 Flying Fortress, the incredible story of the Tuskegee Airmen who flew Mustangs with distinction, deep dives into specific battles, and so much more. This channel is dedicated to telling these stories with the detail and respect they deserve. These weren't just historical events. They were real people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. And the more we remember and understand what they accomplished, the better we honor their sacrifice. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue exploring the greatest generation's finest moments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.